Good evening. Welcome to the Institute. Welcome back in many cases, I think. I'm delighted to be here tonight chairing this discussion of how minority government might work, if that is what we end up with in 2 months or so. My name's Akash Paun. I'm a fellow here at the Institute, and it was nearly 6 years ago now that I started work on a project here in partnership with the Constitution Unit, looking forward to the 2010 election and thinking about what might happen if there's a hung parliament. And I remember through most of the course of that project during 2009, all the opinion polls were suggesting we'd have a conservative majority government. People sort of wondered why we were looking at this intellectually, academically interesting subject, but one unlikely to have much relevance. And I sometimes wondered myself if it was going to have any relevance. But of course we know what happened next in the May 2010 election. And since then we've had the fascinating experience of seeing how Westminster and Whitehall have adapted to coalition government. But of course coalition government is only one possible solution to the problem of governing and forming a government without a single party having a majority. And today we're here to hear about the principal alternative to that, minority government. So I'm delighted to have the panel that you can see in front of you, all of whom have personal and significant experience of making minority government work in very different contexts. And I shall introduce them to you, though no doubt you will be aware of their backgrounds already. I mean, in the 2009 project I referred to, we studied a number of case studies of how minority government has worked elsewhere and in the past. One of those was the LibLab pact in the 1970s, which of course kept the Callaghan administration afloat for 18 months or so. And so I'm very pleased to have Lord Donoughue seated to my left of me. Lord Donoughue was head of the policy unit in number 10 Downing Street throughout that period, actually, of small majority and minority rule between 1974 and 79. So I think the government never had a majority of more than 3 and was in a minority for most of that time, yet you managed to keep it in office for over 5 years in total. So very interested to hear your recollections and thoughts about how you can make it work. Second to speak to my right, Sarah Smith, who was Director of Strategy in the Scottish Government in 2007 when the SNP first came to power, of course, with a very small minority government. Actually, they only had, I think it was 47 or 48 seats out of 129, so far short of majority, no sort of support arrangements with any of the other major parties. And yet, of course, not only did they survive in office for 4 years, they went on to win a majority at the next election. So perhaps some positive lessons there for people here if we do end up in that position in May. And then third to speak will be Darren Hughes, who was a Member of Parliament and Minister in New Zealand for around a decade, I think, during which time New Zealand, as it still is, was governed by a succession of minority governments supported by confidence and supply agreements with various smaller parties, which of course is another potential model that people might be looking to learn from at Westminster. So really fascinated to hear your thoughts about lessons from that experience. So that's enough from me, I think. We're going to speak in the order I've introduced the speakers. I should just mention this discussion is, as you'd expect, on the record. We're filming it, live streaming it, tweeting it, and probably some other things I've forgotten about as well. So that goes for Q&A as well, of course. So just be aware. And please do take part in our online discussion on Twitter if you like. There's a hashtag up there behind me if you'd like to do that. We have until 7 o'clock, so each of the speakers will speak for 10 minutes or so, then be Q&A in the usual fashion, and then drinks in the usual fashion as well. afterwards. So, Lord Donoughue.
Thank you. I should begin by apologising to those of you who spent £2.50 on the Financial Times on Saturday, where I sort of gave a little preview of what I am going to say here. And for Chatham House rules, I was delighted today to learn that the Labour Party had refused to put it on their website. So if Pravda's against it, it must have had some virtues in it. Also, if my voice is a little hoarse, I was last week, as always, because it's compulsory religious festival at the Cheltenham races, and my voice has suffered, not from cheering home my winners, because there weren't many, but as always from drinking too much Guinness from damp glasses, which the dampness seems to affect the throat. But I'll try and do what I can. What I would say is I want to speak in favour and strongly of minority governments, and wishing that our leaders would pursue that path. What has struck me in Parliament in the last few months is though everybody's convinced there'll be no majority, and I can see that, everybody will lose out of this election, they all assume that you must then have a coalition, and that's what happens. And I want, as in the FT, to strongly argue against that, and that there are the alternatives which we lived under in the Labour government from 1974 to 9. As you rightly say, we gave practice to all three kinds of government. We had a brief period of majority government, and we had a period of the loose pact, which we called pay-em rations, but they have a different term for it these days, with the Lib Dems, which was very successful. Though I have to say, the people doing it were what you could call mature adults, and that meant it was much easier then than now. And so it's not necessarily the obvious solution. Coalition is, to me, really the other alternative is minority government, which I speak for. Majority, minority, or coalition. Coalition we have seen in the last 5 years, and I don't like coalitions. I like governments with the authentic, coherent culture of one of the parties. Now, we're not faced with the coherent culture of the Green Party, fortunately, but of the parties that are possibly going to do it, I would rather have a minority government of either than a coalition of any. And coalitions have major disadvantages. They have muddles. They have a muddle of people, in that the people are from very different political cultures, and you have to, in a formal coalition, have in your government members of the minority party, regardless of whether they're up to the job or not. Now, we've seen in this coalition there's certain people, I think Chris Huhne, Ed Davey, should never be allowed near a major economic department like energy. But that happens and is part of the deal, and I'd rather have people from the same family. You have a muddle of policies because at the beginning you have this coalition prior agreement conducted as last time in great haste by people, some of them political advisors, who have no experience whatsoever of being in government. And you end up committed to an agreement which is at best irrelevant and at worst damaging 3 or 4 years down the line, when the problems are totally different. So you muddle people, muddle policies. If you can avoid that, you should. And the advantage of minority governments, the disadvantage we know is you don't have a guaranteed majority. Well, we know that, But most people say that means instability and you'll soon fall. We didn't have an unstable minority government, and we didn't fall for 5.25 years, and then only by one vote, and that was only, we could have won if Jim Callaghan had been willing to bring in the sick and the dying, or if he'd been willing to give the Tory MP who offered to abstain the peerage he wanted. So you can last a long while. It's a different form of stability or instability, but it's true you don't have the guaranteed majority, but that may not be, it may not mean as much as you think. It means a lot if you've got political leaders who are a particular kind of what I call non-testicular invertebrates. Now, we have those, and David Cameron was one in 2010, and that's why he daren't do a minority government, because he wanted his guaranteed majority. And they, I suspect, all three of that category now. So they will be very tempted to get the guaranteed majority. But if you've got some guts and some guile, you can do what we do, which is what minority governments do. And I'll just for 2 or 3 minutes explain what we did. Firstly, you have skilled whips, adult, mature, long trousers, experienced, and you go from week to week and from issue to issue, and you negotiate your majority. It's a different form. You haven't got it guaranteed. You have to negotiate it along the way, but we did that week by week. Every week the Daily Mail would announce that our next week's piece of legislation, you know, execute all red-haired Welshmen or some highly popular piece of legislation we had, and the Daily Mail would announce there was no majority for it. The government would therefore lose, and we would fall on the vote of confidence. Now, at the beginning in there, and I was a young lad, and I'd set up the policy unit and was new to those things, I was quite nervous, and I thought I'd given up my job at the LSE, given up the tenure and all of that, and every week I thought, my God, I'm going to be unemployed with 4 small children. And it seemed likely. But after the whips had got to work, we found we got a majority. And we also found something else, which after this May election, a minority government would find, and that is that the opposition doesn't want an election. So week by week, we found that the Liberals didn't have any money for an election, and other small parties didn't have money for an election. The Labour Party wouldn't have any money for a second election after this. So the parties don't want an election. The individual MPs, having just got their feet into Parliament, are not very keen to put it at risk with a new election. So we went week by week, and the majorities emerged, and we survived 5.25 years. So minority governments are a practical form of government. It's unstable, but turned out stable. It's not guaranteed, but it worked. So I think that was an example. And another important thing we found was that each week I would attend in number 10 with the Prime Minister and the whips, discussions of the next week's business and where we would have the votes and we might fall. So you have to make concessions. So we would plot in advance what you concede, including to your own side, because the Labour Party in those days had a bunch of lunatics out on the left wing. And so you have to be able to concede people to your own and to the others. On the whole, we identified the things, as far as I was concerned, that I didn't want in the bill anyway. And we found other people were very happy to take that and then give you their vote. Now, you Scots would be, you're cleverer than the Anglo-Saxons, so you would do this even better. And it worked. And I think it could work again. And I would hope after the next general election that one of the party leaders would be willing to risk that. It appears my own party leader is not too keen on risking that. And Cameron too will want to do a coalition. But the interesting thing about the minority government option in the Conservative situation is that if Cameron decides he wants to go in bed with the coalition of, well, I put into the Financial Times the only sentence they took out, which was it wants a coalition of losers, lunatics and wankers. And for some reason, they took that out. But if Cameron again wants that, because he's lived for 5 years with that, what will happen? First, unlike last time, he cannot just do it, because the Conservatives are a bit shrewder now, and they know that he doesn't believe in anything and will sell, anything. So he has to go to the 1922 committee, which is chaired by one Mr. Brady, a very good man, who Cameron sacked. Now Cameron sacked Owen Paterson, one of the best people in his government. He demoted Gove. He earlier got rid of Brady. I mean, that man is looking for a fall. Callaghan would have made sure they were all on board. Graham Brady, will be chairman of that 1922 committee, not desperate to give Cameron everything he wants. But if Cameron is suggesting that, and many of his party don't want it, I've had dozens of emails from Tories about the FT piece saying, good on you. Then it's an opportunity. There might conceivably be another Conservative MP then in Parliament who might want to be leader instead of Cameron. And just think, for Boris, he doesn't have to say, I'm opposing dear Cameron. He just says, I would like to lead a genuine Conservative minority government as opposed to Cameron's, lib sort of mishmash. And that would produce an interesting situation. Sorry, have I gone on too long?
I think that's probably a good point to stop. But
yeah.
But no, thanks very much for that forthright defence of minority government and much else. So I'll now move across to Sarah to speak about the Scottish experience.
Thanks very much. And I'm going to talk about our experience in Scotland of moving to a minority government in 2007. I'm currently University Secretary at the University of Edinburgh, responsible in the senior management team there. But in 2007, I was Director of Strategy and Ministerial Support, responsible for Cabinet Secretariat, Strategy and Delivery Units, and relevant to here, reporting to the Permanent Secretary in terms of taking the lead in ensuring a smooth transition over that electoral period. So what I thought I'd do is just say ever so briefly in a few words what happened for those of you who might not be aware, but then talk through what I think some of the key learning was. And I suspect a lot of that learning is more directed to my ex-civil service colleagues in the room. So in terms of what happened, in May 2007, we had our third election in the Scottish Parliament. And as has already been mentioned, the SNP won 47 seats. And this was only one more than the incumbent Labour Party, who had 46. Then we had Conservatives at 17, Lib Dems 16, Green at 2, and Independent at 1. So this was the potential outcome of an SNP minority government, to be honest, was not one of the ones that we had particularly modelled in our scenarios beforehand, although we had thought about minority government. Parliament was very young still. I say it was only the third election, and all of our experience had been about coalition forming up until then. And a point I would like to stress is that we were very aware from as soon as the results came out that if the SNP were to form a minority government, this would be a very, very minority government. They only had 36% of the seats. We weren't actually aware of a precedent of a minority government with less than 40, but no doubt you have one. In terms of the key moments and phases, definitely a really important part of this that was as relevant for whether it was going to be a coalition or whether it was going to be a minority was the pre-election work. And there with the previous First Minister authorising the usual conversations between senior civil servants and opposition parties, it was crucial there because in this instance we were talking about a party that hadn't been in government before in Scotland. And so that ability to have careful and protected discussions which enabled us to be coming at issues from the same side of the table and forming those relationships was absolutely fundamental. And it was really important as together we worked through what the implications of minority government might be in those first few days and weeks. The second key thing I wanted to mention was that what sounds like an obvious point, but wasn't, which was establishing who was actually going to lead doing what as soon as we got the result. It wasn't a foregone conclusion that the party that got the most votes would have the authority or the legitimacy to lead either in terms of coalition negotiations or in terms of a minority government. It was helpful to us that the Labour Party lead made it very clear right from the beginning that they felt there was a legitimacy, that one seat made the difference. And therefore, we all knew what we were dealing with and that the SNP had the authority, if you like, to see what they could do in terms of forming a government. So that was, I'd say a bit of learning from that is just not to assume too much in terms of who's going to lead immediately after you've got the results. We supported the SNP then in thinking through coalition and partnership agreements, and we had significant experience of doing this as civil servants because we had worked supporting political parties before in their coalition negotiations. We were helped in that by work the strategy unit had done, which the classic stuff that you would expect about analysing manifesto commitments, drawing from detailed policy department expertise, and looking crucially at it, in one pages at areas of key points of consensus and areas of key points where there were going to be real issues if we were going to try and get a partnership or a coalition. It was also really important for us to have done preparatory work about confidence and supply agreements, about which I knew nothing about 2 years before the election, but it was really important that we started to understand what other countries' experience had been of these. And it was important, I would say, to be thinking through the likely motivations of the potential coalition partners. It was interesting that the Liberal Democrats, in fact, did not sign up to a coalition with the SNP, and whether that was because of a fundamental difference of principle or whether it was because they were tired or whether it was because they felt that they'd suffered as being the junior coalition partner, one can speculate, but it was important to think about that. Fundamentally, the ability to deal with uncertainty. For the first few days, we didn't know if the SNP would succeed in establishing a coalition. For the next many days, we didn't know how long they would succeed in terms of having a minority government. So I think there were some key points, and I'll talk about those in a second, but I think we certainly as a civil service felt we always had to keep one eye open for the what-if scenario and what would happen if this didn't succeed. The main thing I wanted to say has already been said, in fact, by my colleague, which was about taking an assets-based approach. And I think this was the most important bit of learning for us in those first few days. We worked with the SNP in thinking through the implications of minority government, but all through the prism of looking at the potential advantages of minority government rather than looking at the potential weaknesses. The SNP had been very clear that they wanted to be able to demonstrate competent government. They hadn't governed in Scotland before. They wanted to show that they were competent at that, and they wanted to show broad partnership working with a whole range of interests in civic Scotland, beyond the heads of the other political parties, if you like. And they started to articulate that, the words kind of come with us. There was this reaching out and trying to get a consensus beyond Parliament for what they were saying that they were about. There were some important key documents at a very early stage. One was the partnership agreement, which set out the SNP government's overall objectives, what they wanted to achieve and how they were going to measure that. But that wasn't just for the government itself. It was saying this is what it wanted the Scottish public sector to align with. So again, it was a reaching beyond Parliament. There was also an important agreement, a concordat, reached with local government, which was basically a deal, but it was a deal that gave stability. And remember, local government had a whole range of political parties in its leadership, but it gave that political stability in a really important area for that whole period. For me, this positive assets approach was the key psychological pivot. That's seeing that from the positive rather than negative. In terms of thinking through implications for Parliament, there's a whole range of things to consider here. I mean, one is about how much legislation do you need, because obviously whether you've got a minority or a majority really only matters if you're trying to get a vote to pass something. In the first few weeks and months, we had a number of debates around what the SNP government said it was trying to achieve, what its strategy, its overall direction. So it didn't have to be about legislation. Also taking a very pragmatic approach, so not setting off on something you can't achieve. So I think thinking creatively about the use of Parliament's time and its space beyond legislation was important. Crucially, recognising that minority government is a challenge for the opposition parties too. In Scotland, in fact, the leader of the Conservative Party had thought publicly about what they thought minority government might mean and how they might play it a year before the election. I wasn't aware of any other parties that had done that. But it is the case that the SNP minority government was able to build coalitions with different opposition parties at different times. You need really good parliamentary management for that, but that's what they were able to do. And there's a recognition that actually you need the different opposition parties to line up against you to beat you, and that can sometimes be more difficult than it sounds. The other key point I wanted to make was about framing and reframing the terms of success. Right from the beginning, the SNP minority government made it clear that losing a vote wasn't a test of survival. But what they did say was, in terms of the budget, or in terms of no confidence, but on anything else, that wasn't a test of survival. They picked symbols of success that they could control. So, for example, the First Minister very early on said he wouldn't change any of his cabinet over the period of his government. He wouldn't change the key cabinet secretaries, the equivalent secretaries of state in the UK system. So he could control that, nothing to do with Parliament. And whether this was deliberate or not, they lost early on a popular issue to lose on in Parliament. So they lost on the trams, which anybody who knows Edinburgh will know was a popular issue to lose on at the time. Having framed the terms of success, they kept reframing the terms of success. So actually, they lost the budget vote, the first budget vote. What happened? The government didn't collapse. There wasn't another election. What happened was that a week later, they won it. They brought it back and won it. In the meantime, the opposition parties, I suspect, had been put into a position where to oppose the budget would be putting them in a position of appearing to turn off the tap in terms of money to the NHS, to schools, whatever. So framing success, reframing it, and kind of holding your nerve, I think, were all things that came out of that period. In terms of key lessons for the civil service, I think the importance both of being prepared and being ready to demonstrate capability. The kind of manifesto analysis we did was important not just because of its content, but it showed we'd thought about it and that we could be trusted to have a sensible discussion from very early days. I think having good, politically astute, experienced people around you ready for anything. So I think one of the things that really helped me in leading on that transition was having a group of about 15 civil servants who knew how to navigate that interface between politics and the civil service and to do that in a proper way. So although it wasn't a scenario that I've been honest about, it wasn't a scenario we'd planned for, we were able to move seamlessly into working on that. I've talked about the importance of relationships before and immediately after the election. We were working through uncertainties and developing this positive narrative together. It was really important we were forming relationships where we could have those sorts of discussions. I think in terms of how we did that, we were quite careful about that. So in the first few days, we brought in key colleagues from the Scottish Government into the discussions. But then we carried on being careful about it because we found it was a really potentially sore point if it appeared after 2 months or 3 months or 4 months that people didn't realise that the government had changed and we had an SNP minority government rather than the Labour Liberal Democrat coalition. So keeping vigilant in demonstrating that the civil service as a whole had understood the change and understood what the change meant. I think open-mindedness and creativity were really important, and this is about the challenging assumptions from our previous experience of government. So this point about building relationships beyond Parliament to sustain and give strength to a minority government was key. And finally, just that ability to navigate through complexity, deal with uncertainty from day to day and week to week for quite a long period of time. So I hope these reflections on Scotland's experience of minority government have been helpful and sparked some thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah. Moving on straight to Darren then.
Thanks, Akash. I think I often think of minority government as actually being reality government, that it most closely reflects the mood of the public, and it gives you the best chance of choosing the political options that are available to all the parties and the components who are part of that minority government. I guess just a few things I want to say. First of all, to make a strong assertion that it works. In the New Zealand experience, none have broken, so any minority government that has been signed up to have all lasted. I think it's important to say that it's iterative. Each minority government, the rules, the culture, the experiences builds on the one that went before, so there's no need to design the perfect model for the first time, and if that's not achievable, that doesn't mean that the entire notion of minority government doesn't work, and I'll talk a bit about how that's evolved in New Zealand. Critically, there are no rules to this. The old order is clearly being washed away right in front of us, and so what has to come in its place has to be a workable response to that. One thing I'm struck by talking to people across all the parties in the UK is just how narrow the view is of the range of possibilities for governing arrangements. It's just tangible how in a box people think these things are. So if it's minority government, it has to be exactly what they did in the 1970s, otherwise that's not minority government. If it's to be coalition, it must be the way the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats have worked the last 5 years, otherwise that's not coalition. And in fact, there's a broad canvas for many reasons that I want to talk about. I think the other thing to recognise is that when I talk about the old order being washed away, there's a very proud traditional system here, but it is a two-party system, and it's now trying to cope with six-party politics. And very few people think that six-party politics is going away. So you end up with kind of lottery elections where people are fearful of the result rather than looking hopeful to what might be an outcome for the election. In New Zealand, that opening up of the party system meant that on average under the old first-past-the-post system there were 2.4 parties on average, 0.4 for obvious reasons rather than being half-wits or anything like that. And then we've moved to a system now where there's regularly 7 or 8 parties in the Parliament covering the ideological spectrum, and that seems to me to match voters' reality far more than the party fantasy of we can just get 35% of the vote and get a majority and do wonderful things for people, and then maybe we'll get re-elected on something good like 37 or 38% of the vote. It's just a lack of ambition that no parties are talking about even getting 40% of the vote anymore. I think the New Zealand experience has been that it has certainly worked for the big parties, the two major parties, Labour on the centre-left, the Conservative Party on the centre-right, called the National Party. It has certainly been an effective way of operating for them, and has done a lot to restore trust and faith in politics. Although there's no, I want to stress everything I'm going to say, minority government, PR, cooperation, all these things doesn't suddenly make pixie dust fall from the sky and everyone behaves wonderfully kind and loving to each other. There's still human beings trying to represent other human beings and interests, so we've got to keep that in mind. What's much less clear is whether it works for the smaller parties. I would argue that it's more successful for them than full coalition, but it's still very, very tough. And so far in New Zealand, after 7 general elections under the new system, no smaller party that's been associated with the government has returned with more votes or more seats after that experience of supporting a government. And so that's something that I think does need to be acknowledged. But I think that is a Hobson's choice, really, because if smaller parties stay out of government, or if you only have a two-party voting system, then they're never going to get anywhere near the chance to implement even some of their policies. So I guess the minority government does give them the chance to at least have some experience in politics. And so I think what's attractive about minority government is that voters look as though they will continue to be largely attracted to around 2 larger parties. But they're getting nowhere near the 97, 98% of the vote they used to. And in fact, in one poll today, they could barely manage 60% between the two of them. But it does allow for parties that represent voters in that other 35, 40%, that there's a chance for them to have representation. just want to say a quick word about how this all came about. In New Zealand, there had been a tradition of first past the post for many years, and it did what it does best, strong, decisive results. But in the 1970s and early 1980s, it twice produced the wrong winner, that the party that got the most votes by a reasonable margin in a New Zealand setting didn't form the government. And then when that was finally corrected and two governments of both sides came along with a majority of the votes and the largest number, majority of the seats and the largest number of votes, there was a feeling that an elected dictatorship had taken hold. So parties campaigned on one manifesto and then did exactly the opposite. In fact, in one of the governments, my own party, they published a manifesto after the election, and a stunning display of humility, and then proceeded, having won the landslide, then proceeded to do exactly the opposite of what was in the after the election published manifesto, which takes mistrust to a whole new level. So there was a royal commission to look into all of this that recommended PR, and then there were referendums to choose this, and it went ahead. So I guess the difference here is that now in New Zealand, neither of the major parties ever believes that they will form a majority government on their own. So when they're campaigning, they say, look, of course we're not going to. It's very hard to get over 50% of the vote, although the National Party came very close last September in New Zealand to a majority in their own right. So it means that the faux belief that we put up with every day here, that one party will win and win well, is not part of the political dialogue. New Zealand only has one chamber, but it does, like the UK, have an unwritten constitution, which it seems to me offers a lot of opportunity to be innovative around minority government, which is why it's so good to have this event and others like it, challenging people who have a more narrow view on what's possible. I think one of the things that I think minority government has done is introduce themes of government rather than just rules of government and policies of government. So now governments of whatever persuasion base their relationships with other parties, regardless of the status of those relationships, on things like good faith. And so these terms are written into the language of government, that parliamentary parties outside of the executive are expected to behave in good faith with one another. That there's a no surprises policy, so that even if a party doesn't work with you on a set of issues, but you know it could cause them some grief or some interest, that you will work with them in an open way so they know something is coming that may have an impact on them. And a big emphasis on cooperation and consultation where it is possible. So that changes the tone, I think, and that's where leadership is also important in changing the tone and the culture of government management, because it's not just the mechanics of government. Tim Bale, who's here tonight from Queen Mary, has written about it not just being minority government, but minority governance. And I'm quite attracted to that idea, that it goes beyond just the usual mechanics of a government. This is about how parties, politicians, and actors all conduct themselves. I really want to emphasise the point about House management. Often the House leaders and the whips are not part of the leader-to-leader negotiations, but they're expected to operationalise these decisions and cause, I would say no embarrassment, but as little embarrassment as possible on the floor of the House. And so it's very, very important to have good people in those roles who have the give and take and who know about consultation and listening. It's important that the major policy ministers and portfolio ministers are able to deal with their counterparts and the other parties in a respectful way. And as the legislature gets more responsibilities, that select committee chairs are also part of that conversation and discussion. I'd also emphasise the role of the Chief of Staff for the Prime Minister, but also the other party leaders in smoothing the waters and being able to look beyond what's going to happen in the next week or two in a way that politicians often struggle to because of the heavy workload, you understand. And Chiefs of Staff play an important role. I do agree with that it's still okay to lose votes. We've defined our politics for so long by must have a majority, must win every vote, must show power at every turn. It's just in a minority government sitting, you do not enjoy the support of over half the country. You do not get over half the seats. You're going to lose some votes from time to time, and it's okay. And that's a discipline on the politicians, but also on the media and the public too, not to think it's a shambles just because the government loses an occasional vote. I mean, big deal. What's the problem? It's only a big problem if you cannot get agreement on budgets or routinely lose confidence votes, I guess. a fairly obvious point. And personality is also very important to that, people knowing who they're dealing with, and that is part of this iterative reference I made before, that if these people, if the key actors get to know each other, a lot more can be achieved. And that's about being open and honest about what the likelihood of success are for the parties. Because I've, I guess, been more conditioned into this style, I was really shocked on the Today programme a few weeks ago to hear the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, interviewed on the radio, and she referred to having only met Ed Miliband once or twice in passing, so that they don't know each other very well, there's no relationship, and yet, quite apart from the political realities we might be facing in a few weeks, they both hold fairly important constitutional jobs, and I would have thought that sort of personality beyond the tribe might be important, but maybe that is really naive. I think that just a few other points to make that might go against some of the stereotypes about minority government. One, they can be great success policy-wise. I could rattle off a list of policy successes, as I see them, that the three-term Helen Clark Labor government was able to achieve without a majority on a single day of those 3 terms. The current national government is entering its 3rd term and has a strong policy record. The things that they want to do, they've been able to get done. There hasn't been a sense that policy-wise things have ground to a halt. In fact, some of the most disciplined policies have happened in this situation. For example, our minority Labour-led government was able to eliminate public debt for the first time in the history of New Zealand. Admittedly, that's not all that long. But getting rid of debt when there's always pressure to spend more during the good times, as this obviously was actually is a sign of policy strength and discipline that you might not think possible if there's all the horse trading going on. It doesn't favour one side or the other. This is not some mad lefty ideological thing to bring about minority government. There have been 7 general elections in New Zealand. 4 of them have resulted in centre-right governments, 3 centre-left. So over the long term, if you're good enough, you get elected. Strong leaders do emerge. Helen Clark for Labour, John Key, the current Prime Minister of New Zealand, both if you measure it by longevity and popularity, they're the 2 most successful leaders easily of the last 40 years, both of them minority government leaders. The economy in New Zealand is strong and has not been affected by minority government. So just to finish, the scale of relationships that have taken place, the very first election was a majority coalition, but that only lasted for 2 years, and then since that time, over these 7 general elections, it's been minority every day. The Clark government was a minority coalition. We had one party we worked with in a formal coalition, and then a range of support partners. And probably the most, to finish, the most interesting innovation that's taken place was that by the last term of that Clark government, and then through all 3 terms of the Key government, the support parties that came to work with the government worked on a new system whereby the leader of that party would take on a portfolio, become a minister, not a minister inside cabinet, but a minister outside of cabinet, and actually a minister outside of government. So they would have collective cabinet responsibility for the department which they ran. They'd be bound by the government decisions for that department. But on every other policy issue across government, they were free to speak their mind about the principles of their party, to promote alternative policy prescriptions, public policy ideas from the government of the day that they were supporting. And there have been 3 parties that have at the same time had their leaders as government ministers with significant portfolio responsibilities, supporting a minority government and able to keep their party identity going on other issues. Helen Clark said this was a great idea of something that didn't work in theory but did in practice. And I think that that's part of the innovation you need for minority government. Voters have changed. I don't believe the old system can come back if that's not what the voters want. And so the responsibility is to be imaginative about how minority government can deliver good public policy for Britain. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Darren. And I'm glad you mentioned that the minister's outside government point is something I was very struck by when we looked at New Zealand, and still not entirely sure how that might play out in practice if we had a similar model. But it's very interesting that it's become so established there in New Zealand. I'll open up to questions in just a moment, so please gather your thoughts. I've just got one for the panel of my own. I'm very interested, Darren, you just referred to how Labour managed to eliminate public debt obviously without a majority. Sarah, you referred to, well, the SNP government did lose a vote on an early budget, but in general kept control of public finances. But this is interesting, I think, because this is probably one of the most strongest concerns people might have about minority government here, is that government without a majority might lose control of the public finances and be forced to concede spending, extra spending to other parties that might lead to deficit reduction targets being missed and that kind of thing. So I would just be interested from all three speakers to hear a little bit more about that specific issue. How do you ensure that you keep a good control of the public finances?
Well, our experience is that majority governments are not very good at controlling the public finances. And for our Labour government in the 70s, when it was a major issue,
of course,
we actually introduced some of the main controls of public expenditure that affected our country. We introduced sort of cash controls, and we had the IMF in to help us. But I didn't feel that was one of the biggest problems, no.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, I mean, one of the advantages, I think, of minority government is it does enable a very tight political strategy compared to a coalition government. And so that plays out in Parliament and beyond, and I think it certainly plays out in the handling of the finances. The deal, for example, that the SNP minority government did with local government, it was a deal saying you will have this amount of money over the period. We will maintain and slightly increase the share of money going to local government from central government. But in return for that, there were things like reducing the amount of ring-fence funds, about giving commitments not to restructure, things that didn't actually cost money, but were different ways of doing business.
I think both major parties will want to focus on their fiscal credibility. So they know they'll be running for re-election soon enough. And so in signing up to these plans, you need to have a strong Chancellor, Treasurer, Minister of Finance, who is keeping an eye on the negotiations to make sure it doesn't become the never-never. But I think the smaller parties worry about being criticised for being the tail wagging the dog, so they're not going to want to push too far. The major party, of course, never wants to lose economic credibility, so doesn't want to give too much. And I think the other thing that I didn't say is not quite related to public finances, but more policy in general, is that because you've got to stitch together a parliamentary majority, that takes longer, which means that not only does the cabinet need to negotiate with all these other parties, they need to negotiate with their own parliamentary party. So there's a lot more people involved in the design and the bidding in of policy. So what that means is that some of the signature policies of the Clark government that were hotly opposed by the opposition, by the time there came to be a change of government, they'd been so well implemented, adapted, consulted, included, that actually he said it's not worth trying to unpick all of this. We'll just adopt that and move on with our own agenda. And that's something he said at a breakfast here just a few weeks ago in London. So I think that it does actually give a longer term shelf life to policy, and the costings are part of that, because you need to know that you're going to be pushing for a policy that is fiscally sustainable and politically sustainable as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Okay, questions from the floor. I'll take a few together. Okay, Ian McGee at the front here, and then gentleman here. And then Tim Bale after that. Thanks.
Predominantly a question for Lord Donoughue, but relevant possibly to the other two speakers as well. Bernard, you lived through some tough times and kept going for 5+ years. The IMF you've mentioned, Northern Ireland, wages policy, strong trade unions, and a vociferous left wing within the party as well. You've all given great presentations on the advantages of minority government. What were the couple of downsides that you saw to governing during that time?
Okay, I'll just take the three questions together. And sorry, I should have said, please just say who you are as well.
Gavin Miller, Institution of Civil Engineers. Kind of follows on from a question there. I read recently a comment by Shirley Williams talking about her time in the minority Labour government, and she said the main problem with it was a sheer physical exhaustion of having to work on a bill-by-bill, day, not just week-by-week, but day-by-day basis, with nearly every vote being on a knife edge. And she was a relatively junior minister in the government, but she said it was the same for senior ministers as well. Mm-hmm. So I just wondered if you could expand on the actual, what it means to people involved. You did mention the importance of strong whips, but it's for the ministers too.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. And Tim Bale there.
Hi, I'm Tim from Queen Mary, University of London. Actually, it follows on from the second question, actually. It's maybe something that Darren can talk about, and that is echoing Darren's point about there being a whole series of options that people very rarely consider, actually, in the UK. One of the ways of reducing that very exhaustion and those transaction costs is, of course, for minority government to be based on some kind of written contract. And I wonder if, Darren, you could tell people about the New Zealand experience of those, because actually they're quite common in other countries as well. It doesn't have to be a sort of week-by-week living on your nerves situation. It's perfectly possible to have some sort of halfway house between a coalition agreement and a minority governance agreement.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. And Lord Donoughue, if you wanted to also reflect on that point as far as how the LibLab pact helped to structure relations in a more organised way, that would be quite interesting.
Fine.
Rather than living hand to mouth.
Yeah, as a reply, you have the reply. The real downside was just the physical exhaustion. I remember seeing Shirley just fall slowly asleep in a cabinet committee for half an hour, and everyone understood. But that was also linked to a different parliament system. I mean, the Commons sat halfway through the night regularly then, and they turn up occasionally now. But then they scrutinised legislation clause by clause. Now they don't. They leave it to the House of Lords that scrutinises the legislation for them. None of the Lib Dems have ever explained why, if they managed to abolish the House, how they managed to abolish the House of Lords, who will scrutinise the legislation. Certainly won't be the Lib Dem MPs in the Commons, because they're often not there. So the exhaustion was the main thing, and I think that links the pact with the Liberals, which we negotiated over a long weekend, was a very loose pact. The Liberals didn't demand very much and didn't get very much, and in my view should have got more. I think the Labour government was too ruthless, but the one thing it did was ease this parliamentary situation, and so ministers just had a little more time in bed. And the other factor is how far ahead you plan. Another downside of the week by week is that's the way you strategically thought. And I do think there are advantages if governments sometimes look longer ahead. And then, of course, we had the Central Policy Review staff in government with exactly that remit to look ahead. That's been abolished. And it would help if, I mean, a civil service friend from Number 10 told me that Mr. Cameron's timescale was the Daily Mail tomorrow, and the most important committee was the 10 o'clock or 4 o'clock committee that decided how you manage the press tomorrow. I think if you can take a longer view, that rather helps the quality of the government, and we lacked that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Sarah, do you want to go next? Also actually interested in your sort of response to what Lord Donoughue was just saying about how to ensure you maintain a longer term perspective.
Yes, well, I think the establishment of the National Performance Framework for the SNP minority government was really important, because that was the first time we'd had an articulation of an overall purpose, 5 key strategic objectives underpinning that. And an articulation of what the government was saying it mattered and it was focusing on, and crucially how it was going to measure that and how that was going to be measured in an independent way, not at the government's own hand. So I think it's not the contract that you'll be talking about, but it is a kind of document that provided a sort of certainty. I mean, I guess the downsides are the obvious ones about compromise versus the upsides of having a genuine, shared, engaged understanding of where it is you want to get to, and you can choose where you want to be on that spectrum. It certainly was the case, particularly for the kind of Minister for Parliament, the parliamentary work, that there was a huge amount of effort that had to be invested in that on a day-to-day basis. Even, I'm not sure if it was directly linked or not, but again, challenging assumptions, we'd assumed that as normal there wouldn't be cabinets over sort of 6 weeks of the summer, and we had a cabinet every week for the whole of the summer in that, as soon as the government was brought in. So there was a pace, there was certainly a pace, and we had the first 100 days and what was to be achieved in the first 100 days, and the clarity there. So I appreciate we sound as if we're just singing the praises of minority government, but perhaps that's because there's been not as much said about the fact that you can have tight political strategy and deliver key policy objectives in that structure, because we're just so not used to that in the UK.
Maybe just picking up on that, I think the downsides are for the politicians in the biggest party, because they're used to winning, being able to take all the jobs. You know, if you're an ambitious person, you know there's a career plan for you, and then all of a sudden that's not there. You have to listen and talk to other people, and if you're in the big party, that can feel like a frustration. But I always felt just realistic about that until we were good enough to get over half the votes, we weren't going to have over half the say, and that was the reality, and that wasn't going to change. So I think the downsides are limited to a very partisan view, largely within the biggest party actually, and that's just about adopting and adapting to change. Interestingly, when there was a second referendum on whether or not to keep this system in the last few years, it won with a bigger vote than the first time, so the public are quite happy with it. I think Gavin's point on exhaustion, part of that is changing some of the arcane practices. As Bernard said, there's a difference to the way the Commons operates now, but when New Zealand had a very, very Westminster system, it was more Westminster than Westminster, and so moving to a new system meant changing some of those things. So the idea that grown adults have to go and vote in person at a particular time for something to become the law does seem a bit crazy when you've had a general election, voters have expressed millions of preferences that have been aggregated into the results in the Commons, and yet you're expecting people to go and physically walk through a door before some. So why is that so spiritually important to democracy? So we rethought that and said, well, actually, what you can do is each party has got a certain number of MPs. It's reasonable that some might be away. In the New Zealand case, 1/4. So there's a tight system of leave for that quarter, and it enables a party to vote at full complement while having a quarter of their people away doing public business. And that's worked effortlessly on both sides of politics, and it's meant that, first of all, there aren't bells ringing all the time, and that's good for mental health. And secondly, it's more efficient in terms of running government. On Tim's point, it's very important, I think, to have written agreements and for them to be public and transparent. The very first time it was done, there was a hint that there might have been a secret deal between the leader of the big party and the leader of the smaller party to swap the prime ministership for a year in the middle of the term, and think that didn't end up happening. But the idea that there'd be a secret agreement is totally wrong. You must put it all out as a written contracts, and I think that's one of the reasons why all of the minority governments have lasted. With all the various moving parts and the different personalities, they've all stuck in there for the entire term of each parliament. And if I just think of the last term that we had, there was a coalition with the Progressive Party, so that set out that their leader would be inside the cabinet and set out some policies that they wanted to see progressed. There were two parties that were outside of government but had their leaders as ministers and bound by collective responsibility, as I said, and the leader of one party became Minister of Foreign Affairs, and then as party leader of his party opposed the government signing a free trade deal with China as Minister of Foreign Affairs. Well, no, not as Minister of Foreign Affairs, but as leader of his party. So that's a sort of challenging situation to be in, where your foreign minister, as a party leader, doesn't support a free trade deal, but all worked fine. It was the first one signed in the world. And the United Future Party were a much smaller party. Their leader became the minister in charge of HMRC, always in for the fun jobs. And, but they had some policy requests, but mainly some of the things they asked to be included were things that they wanted the government not to do. So they had a very strong view against the further liberalisation of marijuana law, for example. So they said, we'll sign this arrangement, but we don't want to see any government-sponsored legislation or any support for private members' bill by the government on any liberalisation of marijuana. So you can get down to sort of things where people, there's no cost involved in that, but it's just stating a preference. And then the Greens were not part of those arrangements, but we had a cooperation agreement with them where they would occasionally either abstain or sometimes would support confidence and supply votes. And in that situation, there were two policy areas of interest to them: energy efficiency and a Buy New Zealand Made campaign. And they were able to have a spokesperson be the government spokesperson on those two areas for those two campaigns. So again, another innovation that enabled them as a party to be promoting a policy, and in exchange for that, they would support some aspects of the government program through a cooperation. And then all of those things were, and there's a lot more detail than that, obviously, but those were some of the scale of the arrangements that were possible, and that was just all for one parliamentary term.
Thanks. So yeah, range of possible ways of making it work, even in New Zealand. Okay, some more questions. Yes, Jill Rutter from the Institute. Anyone else? Yes. Okay, and then two people together back there. Thanks.
Well, I'm quite intrigued to ask Darren why the smaller parties get this backlash from getting their sort of pet schemes government. But my real question is, we've talked about structures and written agreements and things like that, but if we look over the Tasman and we look at Australia, you have, a sort of semi-minority government flailing, can't get its budget through after N months, etc. Previous government in turmoil because it couldn't get lots of its sort of policies through and loads of recriminations. So I just wondered whether there's something about the quality of leadership that is also essential to make this work. Whether this is sort of almost, you're making it all sound like a great system of government, but actually, what are the different requirements of the sort of leader that you need to make minority government work? Lord Donoughue might like to reflect on whether he thinks our current leadership is the sort of leadership you need to make minority government work. Slightly implied not.
Yes, so two people there. Thanks, Gary.
Mary Dojewski, journalist. My question is actually quite similar in spirit to the previous one. I wanted to ask, do you think that it's actually easier to run a minority government successfully in a smaller country rather than a bigger country? And do you think it requires a certain, say, experience and maturity of a democratic system that you couldn't necessarily imagine it working in, the places where Brits go and preach democracy, like Afghanistan?
Okay.
Differences in either direction between what's going on at national level and how local government works? Is there any transmission of how minority government works in either direction there?
Okay, thanks. So we'll go along the panel again.
Yes, I think Jill's put a finger very centrally on. I do think you need mature leadership to make it work. I equally think that if you had it for a while, you start producing mature leadership, if you know what I mean. People are conditioned and nurtured by the systems they function in. And we were lucky in that if you think just of Harold Wilson and Jim Callaghan, if you read the press, of course, and we should discuss the press before the end because you have a problem trying to move to a better system with the kind of press we now have. But Wilson had been in, he was key to this, because in February 1974, I was with him, and the Conservative government under Ted Heath was trying to form a coalition with the Liberals under the dubious Jeremy Thorpe. And Wilson wouldn't have any of that. He was perfectly prepared to take on a minority government. Now, he and his successor Callaghan, Wilson had been in Parliament already for 30 years. You know, he'd been in the cabinet 20 years ago. Callaghan, who succeeded him, had been in the Parliament for over 30 years, had been Home Secretary, Foreign Secretary, Chancellor of the Exchequer. These were grown-up people. I worked for both of them and had huge respect for them because they were hugely experienced and wise. So you're right, it does need that kind of person. And there is a problem if you get very junior people who don't have much experience, who on the whole these days have not done any job outside politics. You know, they've been special advisors, research officers, then MPs, and then they find they're running the government. They may find all of the complexities which Darren and you have described very well a bit challenging. So I think you've put your finger there on a very good point, but I actually believe that if we had the system for a while, it would throw up the kind of leaders who had been done an apprentice in that and were, you know, much wiser than the present lot. I mean, you've got to have people who don't come out in support of journalists in a battle with the BBC or things like that. I mean, if I had ever suggested to Harold Wilson or James Callaghan that what they should do is come out in defence of some motoring idiot, I mean, I would quite rightly be heading for a different career. So maturity in leadership is very important, yeah.
Thanks. I mean, given you just touched upon that case, do you also want to expand upon the issue you raised about how the press or the wider media, you know,
yeah, well,
treat minority government,
any
how that
system,
affects things?
in any system, your media is crucial. I mean, they've grown, though the newspapers have diminished in actual power, as it were, but the media overall is hugely important, and it was throughout my time there. But they are part of the responsible government and responsible democracy, and they can make a very important positive role and contribution, and holding the executive to account is absolutely essential. And criticising, when they criticised us for good reasons, that seems to me them performing a crucial part of the democratic process. But if you have people for whose, you know, priorities of what they care about in politics are these minor, petty little things, it doesn't help. I'll just put it like that. And in a minority government situation, which we're not experienced at, which we've done once and might play with again, I think the media could play a huge role, not in being supportive of the politicians, but in making contributions, in creating a debate on how you do it. I see, except for the Financial Times on a Saturday, I see very little signs of that happening now. And if you take this issue of whether we should have a minority government after the next election, now the people in this room and this institute can play a big role, because it's not clear that the media will. It's not clear that the politicians have much understanding of it. Last year, the Constitution Committee of the House of Lords, chaired by Baroness Jay, did a report on coalitions, which you might like to look at. It's a quite good report. But on page 1 it says that there was only one of the scores of witnesses who came to them who ever suggested there was an alternative to coalitions, and it was minority government. And I mean, Margaret Day wrote it in a nice way because it was about me. But the fact that nobody else last year actually went to a parliamentary committee on coalitions and suggested that minority government was an alternative shows how important this gathering is and how it needs the media and people in universities and institutes like this to make that point in the next 2 months, because I don't think it, you know, it hadn't occurred, didn't occur much to the Prime Minister. When I appeared on the Today programme with Catherine, she would know, 2 weeks ago, discussing this important subject, something else they thought was more important, and our sort of 12-minute spot was squeezed down to 2 minutes. And Humphreys, you remember him muttering away, what is this about minority government? What was it he said? Oh, they'll all just be squabbling with one another. I mean, just dismissed it out of hand. Now, so we have a problem that the media makes little contribution. And we have a problem that in the next 2 months we want the maximum debate of the possibilities of minority government. And I hope Darren's staying here for the next 2 months and giving speeches every day.
I think he lives here. But yeah, thanks. And I think the Institute definitely hopes to be not holding lots more events, but certainly engaging with debate on these issues over the next couple of months. Sarah, so a few issues there you might like to pick up on, including, is it easier to do it in a smaller country such as Scotland?
I think it is. I mean, it's one of the things I noticed from moving up from Whitehall to Scottish Government was the ability to engage with a wide range of stakeholders on a particular policy issue, and they can all be in the same room. People personally know each other in a country of 5 million. I think that makes a huge difference in the ability to make those links that I was talking about, those wider partnerships. But conversely, not about maturity. As I say, it was early days for us in doing that. In terms of quality of leadership, yes, but not necessarily a single leader. And I think in my view, what helped the SNP minority government was the combination of the then First Minister and his external positioning and political strategy, and the very careful, very broad-ranging work of the Minister responsible for Finance, John Swinney, who had a very tight grip and understanding across the whole range of the Scottish Government's business. So you can have different kinds of leaders, and I think both are important there. Links with local government, it's not meant to, or parallels, it's not meant to sound flippant really, but I think yes, but it depends which examples you draw, because I think you can see really good learning from that. You can see really poor adversarial learning too, so I think it depends where you look.
Okay, thanks.
Jill, on the smaller party backlash, I mean, that is a real challenge for them. I mean, I think that minority government makes it a slightly easier one, but there's no getting away from it. As I said before, no party has had an increase in their vote after being involved in a government, and some of them go right down, have to build back up. Quote Tim again. Tim has written an article called "The Black Widow Effect" on this. That if a party gets too close to power, then this can have a detrimental effect on their chances. I guess some of it is the fact that people in the political world are all of a sudden seeing new faces speaking on policies, and they're not, who are these people? And so there's some resentment. You get resentment from within the big party who think that their brilliance is being held back by someone from another party. All I'd say to that is that the big parties used to be coalitions of themselves as well. And at least with this system, you put out a written contract at the beginning of the parliament, and you know what you're dealing with, as opposed to which faction will be more dominant in the party at some point in the term that might not be there. You mentioned Australia. The Abbott government is a majority. They're having trouble in the Senate with the budget, but the previous government, the Gillard government, had all sorts of problems. But one of the things they did exceptionally well was pass more legislation, had a great legislative record than governments that had gone before them with a large majority, that was really personality issues. I think even if there'd been a majority, the Kevin and Julia show would have been slightly distracting. I think on the style of leader, obviously it always helps to have a popular one, but a leader that is clear, that sets out a vision, that makes it obvious that the government has a point. So this is a minority Conservative government. We're being supported by 2 other parties. Here's what we're doing together. Here's the point of it. Here's what we're trying to achieve. I think that makes it seem more authentic and credible than it was a game of Connect 4 or something like that, trying to get things put together. And I think a leader who has a consultative approach and listens beyond just the parliamentary deals, but actually out in the community as well. That style of leadership, of being more inclusive, I think goes a long way. And I think Helen Clark and John Key have both demonstrated that. Whether it's easier in a small country, I guess in some ways, just because as Sarah was saying, the people do know each other, but it's not impossible to get to know each other in a larger city. If I think of the first term of power sharing in New Zealand, it was really unpopular because the junior partner had been expected to go with one side and went with the other. All but I think 2 of their MPs were brand new to Parliament and were straight into ministerial jobs. They'd negotiated exceptionally hard, and so they'd got probably a disproportionate number of policy wins, and there was some public backlash about that. So if you'd taken another referendum at the end of that term, it probably would have all been thrown out. But actually, as time goes on, people adapt, they change, and it's as much, as I said at the beginning, iterative and about culture as it is about rules, systems, all the things that we tend to focus on so much in politics. Simon, on the local government point, I mean, there are lots of coalition arrangements at local government, and I think being able to share those experiences is very important, and it helps people to think of different ways of doing things. The Electoral Reform Society is putting out a report next Tuesday, on working together, various forms of coalitions, power sharing, parties working together, drawing on things in the UK, but also Europe and places like New Zealand as well. So I think there is more discussion happening on these points, and it's not to say, just want to re-emphasise, minority government does not mean the country becomes perfect, that the human beings who are politicians representing the human beings who are voters become more reasonable. It's just a different and improved way, and it's not to be done about coalitions either. A formal full coalition is a perfectly legitimate way of running government, but I think the mechanics are much less important to the way of thinking. And I think whether it's minority government or coalition government, there's a different way of thinking about the exercise of power and about developing public policy that is much different to the old first past the post, winner takes all, my way or the highway style, which is just crumbling before our eyes.
Thanks. Time for just 1 or 2 more if there are burning questions out there. Otherwise, the question I would then put to the panel is just, what would be the single most important piece of advice you would give to either David Cameron or Ed Miliband if they find themselves heading a minority government in 2 months' time? And any other final reflections you'd like to make before we break for drinks. So, well, Sarah, should we start with you, if you don't mind?
I think it would be this point about think about the strengths, think about it from a position of strength, not from a position of weakness.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I'd say be inclusive, don't be scared of it, and learn to adapt and lead in a way that more reflects the reality of what the country is thinking than the fantasy of what your party people want to be the case. And I think if leaders can look over the horizon of that, they can put together a solid, credible government that they can be proud to run for re-election on.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much.
I think the point about being inclusive and also talking out is the key to it. And the problem at the moment is that the 2 main parties have 2 leaders who are notorious for just surrounding themselves with a small clique. Cameron with his little Etonian boys, and Miliband has a sort of equivalent. And that's, as you both say to me, that is the wrong way to do minority government. And they've got to expand out, and not only across their parties, but towards the others. And the advantage of minority government is it will force them to do that. And it may mean that the parties ultimately choose different leaders on the basis of having that skill.
Okay, great. Well, thanks very much once again to the three panellists for joining us. Some fascinating thoughts and insights there that we'll certainly be taking forward. I should mention, Darren, you mentioned your report coming out. We will be reporting at the end of March on these issues and how a government may be formed this May. So please look out for our paper too. And before we break for drinks, please just join me in thanking the panel.